I know I counted them last night. There are 12, so this must be, I think this is number 8 this year. The 8th of the year. There will have been 24 CHR seminars in state formations, and if we take the last 2 for which I have director chaired, I will have done 47. 47 CHR events over 4 years. So Brigitte is not here, but Brigitte will be taking over upon my departure when I go on leave May 1st, I think. But be that as it may, let me welcome you all, and let me also, just to get this out of the way so it's not awkward at the end of my introduction, do the announcement, which is Rita Wright will be here on the 20th of February, that's the month, on the rise of early state. We're going to leap back to the Bronze Age and the original states, and I'm very happy we're doing that. But today I want to welcome Rebecca Talley, our CHR fellow, now our one CHR fellow, because John Clark is going back to Scotland. Rebecca came to graduate work at NYU and Cornell with a lot of experience in grant writing and fundraising, broadly connected to Latin America. Jumped into an MA at NYU and then moved on to a PhD at Cornell, where she finished up in 2012 with major field in Latin America, obviously, but minor fields in comparative agrarian history, history of science, race, and gender, and wrote her dissertation, finished in 2012, At the Mercy of the Millers, Empire, Science, and Import Substitution in Colombia, 1930 to 1966. She has taught at Hamilton for a 2-year appointment, and this semester is teaching a very successful course by all Rubers, Prostitutes and Patriots, Gender, Nation, and State in Modern Latin America. So today, the paper is both a case study of a place, a nation, or a state. Is it a nation? But also, I think, really a very significant historiographical analysis of the problem of the state in a major global region. So politics of wheat, hegemony, and everyday forms of state formations in Colombia.
Thank you so much. I want to just thank you in general for the opportunity to be here at Ohio State this year. This has really been just fabulous for me to have the chance to really focus on my work. I'm sure those of you who've been around for a while can remember the first 2 years of teaching and how, how crazy and hectic that is, so it's been really nice to have a chance to just really focus. And the opportunity to work on this paper has actually really sort of helped, I won't say clarify, but gave me lots more things to think about as I am in the process of beginning to revise the dissertation into a manuscript. And just to sort of give you a broad overview, I just want to sort of situate this particular paper within the overall manuscript, just to give you a sense of what the project was about. I'll just be very brief on that. The project itself, I actually, gave it the catchy title of, when people would ask what my dissertation is about, well, it's about everyday forms of import substitution industrialization. So of course, everyday forms, of course, being one of the things I talk about quite a bit here in the paper, which hopefully most of you have read. And then import substitution industrialization being an economic policy that was implemented throughout Latin America between the 1950s and 60s, primarily but broadly between 1930 and 1990 approximately. And I was interested in looking at the connections between discourses of the nation, the state, and the economy, and what this could tell us about nation-state formation in Colombia, which is, of course, a problem that has rarely been specifically addressed, as I know I talked about in the paper. Just to give you a sense of some of the things I talked about, I'm just going to show you a couple of images here. I don't know, maybe we can turn the lights down for just a second, since they don't seem to be very visible. So first, just in the dissertation, I was focusing specifically on wheat, So debates about the production, importation, and consumption of wheat in Colombia, which of course is not something that most people think of, not the first product that they think of when they think of Colombia. And I found a variety of different ways that people, depending on who they were, their social position, their professional position, their economic interests, there were a variety of different ways that people were talking about the nation, the state, and the economy in relation to wheat. And just to give you a sense of some visual imagery that will give a sense of the kinds of ways that people talked about it. So this is an image from a publication from the Ministry of National Education, of course. It was focused on, this particular publication was focused on providing education for farmers in the countryside. And you can see it's got this very lovely image in the center of this beautiful woman with the wheat in the background here and in the foreground as well. And it's surrounded by these lovely scenes, these sort of idyllic rural scenes. So some people were talking about wheat and wheat production in this sort of standard ways that people thought about the countryside in Colombia at the time. Well, I shouldn't say standard. The way that some people thought about the countryside in Colombia at the time, as this sort of idyllic agrarian place. But nevertheless, still in this case, making an important contribution to national self-sufficiency by growing wheat. So coffee is still important. This figure down here in the lower corner, she's actually harvesting coffee. Coffee still matters in the countryside. It still matters to the national economy. But more importantly, at this time, in this era of import substitution, which I guess should explain meant, substituting imported goods with domestically produced ones. So there were a number of protectionist policies put in place. So again, there's still, it's an agrarian form of life, but nevertheless still making an important contribution to national economic development and self-sufficiency. Another group of people talking about wheat and its connection to the national economy and the goals of self-sufficiency were the bakers. So this, of course, was from the publication, their publication, which I do talk about in the paper. So again, they had a very different kind of sense of wheat and its connection to the national economy. This is obviously a much more industrialized form of, of national economic organization involving standardized production processes, which we can clearly see exemplified here by these identical pieces of bread, which, by the way, is not the kind of bread that Colombians consumed then or now. But again, it's, these are standardized forms of loaves of bread, but they're still being produced in Colombia. So again, the idea here is industrialized production in our nation. And then finally, another image of Colombian national economic development actually came from outside Colombia. Surprise, surprise. The USDA. This is a map of Colombia from a U.S. Department of Agriculture's publication that came out in 1961 about wheat production in Colombia. And the report was focused on how do we sell more wheat to Colombians. And you can see here, their vision is primarily focused on economic development in Colombia as it relates to export agriculture. So you can see they've highlighted very clearly. They've got coffee, cacao, which of course was being used internally in Colombia but could also be exported. Bananas up here, that was very important at the top. Cotton, tobacco. So they're listing major export crops, major industrial crops. There's one small area here where they mentioned wheat, which did not entirely conform to the entire area of Colombia where wheat was being produced. But again, so a different vision of Colombian economic development. And so these were the kinds of things I talked about in various chapters and tried to sort through these a massive array of different ways of understanding the state. And this manuscript, it joins a small but growing body of work in Colombia that's really starting to take the idea of the state a little more seriously. Up till recently, most people writing about the state, as I indicate in the paper, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, just assumed it was weak, ineffective, and there hasn't been a lot of historical work really examining its historical formation. So this sort of joins that body of work. It also joins a broader body of work, which is also really minimal, which is the analysis of import substitution industrialization itself. This was, again, an economic policy throughout Latin America, but region-wide has been relatively understudied. And most of the studies that have been done by economists who were mostly trying to explain why it failed, rather than looking at what sorts of effects it had on political consciousness within the countries themselves. So in terms of today, and this particular paper, I'm going to be focusing primarily on just the bakers, obviously, since that's what, I'm sorry, this was something illustrating what import substitution industrialization meant. Again, this wasn't a project that meant, for some places it meant sort of closing your economy off to the rest of the world. That's not what it meant in Colombia. Coffee was too important to the national economy, so they couldn't have ever closed themselves off. What it really meant was just, as much as possible, preserving or conserving foreign reserves, so the dollars they had, for imported machinery, things that would help them industrialize. So attempting to produce and consume more consumer goods that were made in Colombia itself. And you can see here, this is an advertisement that appeared in the Baker's magazine for yeast, a yeast company. And of course it's a symbol of a grand Colombian effort, the fact that this company is making it, the national yeast company, and down here at the bottom it's got this nice, buying this yeast will help contribute to the country's economic independence by saving our foreign reserves. So this was the kind of project that people were talking about and debating. But again, I'm going to talk mostly about the bakers today. I don't want to repeat everything that was in the paper. I'm assuming, I hope correctly, that most people have read it. I'll give a couple of the sort of historiographical highlights, sort of where this is situated in terms of the state, and then just some more concrete details about the bakers themselves. So some things that I did include in the paper, but a few other things that I didn't include, which hopefully will help give a little bit more concrete sense of what they were talking about. So in terms of the Latin American state, obviously it's not surprising to say that there are a variety of ways of approaching the state in Latin America. As I mentioned in the paper, there's this sort of top-down, bottom-up kinds of models. Violence and coercion is important. The questions about how much importance this has in developing the state is a very important question in Latin American history. Certainly, this of course changes depending on historical circumstances. So for example, for quite a number of years in Mexico, people were focusing more on questions of sort of hegemony, consent, and less on questions of violence and coercion. In recent years, as Mexico has seen its levels of violence increase, people have begun talking a little bit more about violence again in relation to the state of Mexico. But again, there's a wide variety of models. The one that I found particularly compelling, both as a graduate student, while I was thinking about my dissertation, and still find compelling, is the one that, the volume titled Everyday Forms of State Formation, which was published in 1994, an edited volume. And it basically combines two distinct concepts from two different sets of scholars. So the first is Corrigan and Sayers' The Great Arch, so a book about English state formation. And their argument, of course, being that the state, in some ways, there really is no state. It's a sort of mask. It's hiding the power relations in society. And that state formation itself is a cultural transformation. It involves, in some cases, in most cases likely, a centuries-long process of transforming people into a relationship with the state. But doing so in a way that sort of masks the power dynamic, that masks what's at play. They eventually came up with a term they called moral regulation, so where people sort of internalize the rules of the game, the political meetings of the state as they come to become part of the state. So the contributors to this volume took that on one hand and combined it with James Scott, The Moral Economy of the Peasant, which of course was a very different sort of understanding.
Can I turn it on?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to see you.
Of course, I should have said that. I'm sorry about that. You know, a different understanding of power in society, where Corrigan and Say were sort of dealing from the sort of top down. James Scott's looking at it from the bottom up, and his idea, of course, being that, you know, peasants, you know, live, you know, he was of course focusing primarily on peasants, you know, but that they have an understanding of the power dynamics in the place where they live, in which, you know, there are certain rules, and these rules are focused on reciprocity between themselves and whoever the person or the entity in power might be. Most often, you know, in studying peasants, this would be some sort of landlord. And as long as those rules were obeyed and the landlords did not ask for too much and perhaps threaten the peasants with starvation, the peasants would accept the fact that there was a hierarchical relation in their society. It was only when landlords demanded too much and potentially threatened peasants with starvation that they would sort of rebel. But as long as these sorts of reciprocal relations were being followed and adhered to, you know, things would generally remain rather calm and peaceful. Scott, of course, was complaining about the fact that, you know, people mostly studied peasants when they were rebelling, you know, rather than looking at them at any other time. So the contributors to this volume combined these two ideas, and to talk about something, you know, what some of them talked about, or what some of them labeled a sort of neo-Gramscian form of hegemony. The idea that the governors ruled with the consent of the governed. But they made some important qualifications, or made it, there were a couple of things they thought were very important to understand about this idea of hegemony. Whereas some might have assumed that this meant ideological consent, what they argued was that there was, you know, that this was not a form of sort of false consciousness on the part of the peasants. They were aware that they were in a hierarchical relationship, and as long as, again, there was some sort of reciprocity between popular classes in the state, people were okay with staying put in this kind of power relation. But hegemony, of course, was not something that the state or the powers that be that were attempting to form the state could build and then just expect to keep going all on its own. Hegemony meant it was not permanent, it wasn't static, and it also, it needed to be continually renewed. It also implied constant negotiation with subaltern classes, as well as the need to incorporate some of their ideas or their needs into the state projects, and that was really key for the powers that be to actually achieve some sort of hegemonic control. You know, of course, I see this as being closely related to the idea of legitimacy. You know, a state, there's a strong connection there. So, of course, this volume became very popular in Latin American history, was adopted by a number of analysts, especially for Mexican history. Unfortunately, not so much for Colombian history. Part of the reason for that is because Colombia has always been perceived as having a weak nation and a weak state. And there are a variety of explanations that have been put forth for this, starting with the topography itself. You know, people have claimed that, and they're not entirely wrong, I mean, it's got an incredibly mountainous, broken terrain. I know when I was still a graduate student, I actually decided to write about Colombian history without ever having been there before, which was always a yes indeed. I sometimes wondered, wait, if that was such a wise decision, but I remember before I went, you know, reading all sorts of things, and everything started with the terrain and how horrible it was, and people couldn't get around anywhere, and it was, you know, broken. This was the word that was always thrown around, and I mean, it's mountains, how bad can it be? And yeah, I was really impressed, especially in the coffee zones. It's actually really quite incredible. I remember chatting with someone after I'd been to Colombia about how it was even possible for people to grow coffee on these slopes that were practically vertical. I don't know how they do it. And she had told me, she said, yeah, you know, one time she was in the countryside in the coffee zone, and she saw this mule on one of the slopes, and she remembered panicking, the mule is gonna fall off the hill. I mean, it was just, it's just crazy. The other thing I also didn't believe that I read about, that I kept reading about, was how cold it was. You know, Colombia is divided into climatic zones depending on the altitude. And Medellin is wonderful. It's always spring. They call it the land of the eternal spring. Bogota is freezing. And I read this, everyone told me this, I refused to believe it, and arrived to Bogota with sandals. Anyway, so one of the explanations, again, is just about the topography itself, that it prevented communications among regions. It also meant that you saw the emergence of sort of self-sufficient regional economies, and rather than the development of any sort of national kind of economy. So certainly the topography has played an important role in explaining why there's supposedly a weak nation-state in Colombia. In terms of national identity, you know, people also like, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on the variety of racial and ethnic groups and how this has, you know, prevented the development of any kind of a sense of a nation. Colombia, unlike some other Latin American countries, doesn't really have the sort of, you know, it's not like Brazil that has the sort of myth of racial democracy, or, you know, Mexico even with this sort of cosmic race, you know, the sense that, you know, we're all mestizo. So that those kinds of racial discourses of we're all the same haven't had the same kind of weight in Colombia. Other reasons explaining the weakness of the state, again connected to the topography ultimately, but the fact that the state itself doesn't have full territorial control, evidence for this usually being the fact that there are different guerrilla groups that have, you know, controlled certain parts of the country in the 20th century. Insufficient institutional capacity, so the institutions of the state are themselves seen as weak. Many of them were sort of semi-public agencies. So again, a wide variety of reasons people have given to claim, you know, to explain the weakness of the Colombian state. Of course, the most important one, or one of the most important, is the idea of exclusion. So the fact that popular classes were excluded from participating in the political life of the country. In some ways, for most of the 19th century and into the 20th century, it was formal exclusion. Universal male suffrage was put in place at the time of independence and then reversed in the mid-19th century and not put back in place until 1930. So certainly there was a legitimate basis for claiming there was some form of formal exclusion, but then there was also the sort of informal exclusion as well, where, you know, an oligarchy is said to sort of rule the roost in Colombia and basically exclude popular classes at all. Interestingly, what I always found interesting as I was reading about Colombia in comparison to other places is that many of these things were true for other places as well, including Mexico, which, of course, you know, much of what's been written about the state in many ways in Latin America, a big chunk of it, has centered around Mexico. And despite the fact that many of these things are also true for Mexico, and there are many ways that we can point to the weakness of the Mexican state, people still talk about the Mexican state as if it is something that exists, as if it is something that's a legitimate object of study. So that always bothered me. You know, why can't we talk about the Colombian state, despite whatever weaknesses it might have? I think in the paper I mentioned the one analyst who described the Mexican state as Swiss cheese, you know, so sort of incomplete control. Why can't the Colombian state be the same? And intriguingly, this is beginning to change. So just as the levels of violence in Mexico are changing the way people are currently talking about the state, in Colombia as well, as violence has decreased, a number of people have begun to talk about the Colombian state or Colombian nation formation in the last decade. There's been a small, still small, but a growing body of work. One of the terms that was, of course, most important for talking about exclusion in terms of the Colombian state was the issue of convivialismo, which I did talk about in the paper. This is a concept which in the Colombian historiography has been used primarily to discuss elite actors. So convivialismo was this concept where, essentially a sort of conciliation, cooperation, a sort of unwritten agreement between elites of different parties. This, of course, is another reason Colombia, something that's supposedly unique about Colombia is the strong adherence to political parties among popular classes as well as elite classes. But again, in Colombia, convivialismo is this idea that the elites, no matter what their partisan affiliation, have decided to work together in order to govern the country. This, of course, is a concept that emerged after a very brutal civil war at the beginning of the 20th century. But, okay, so we can't have this, we need to work together. We can't be fighting with each other, even if we disagree with each other politically. But convivialismo, of course, places the sort of elites in one category and as opposed to all the rest of the country, the popular classes. So in other words, as analysts who've described this have said, the elites sort of saw themselves as the same, even though they had different political opinions. They had similar educations, they had similar culture backgrounds, they were all interested in poetry and oratory and very fine and beautiful speech. They went to the same symphonies, they went to the same operas, they talked about the same books. They were also of similar ethnic origins, they had similar skin color. They also believed, they all saw themselves as being sort of honorable gentlemen and opposed themselves to everyone else in the country. So again, most analysts who've talked about convivialismo discuss it in terms of this core elite class. But there is a way that it's also been evident among more popular sectors, although hasn't always been described as convivialismo, and this is the ways that popular sectors have also adopted the sort of language of respect, formality, and as well as a recognition of the social hierarchy. So there's these superiors at the top and everybody else down here. There's an adoption of the sort of oratorical language. I saw it all over the documents in the archives everywhere. So an attempt to write letters, in beautiful and fine ways. However, often, especially when writing to state officials, using beautiful language to be self-deprecating. So I'm sorry, I can't write as eloquently as somebody from, the city. My words will fail me. So writing very beautiful things, but at the same time, in the process, recognizing the social distance between themselves and those at the top. However, the recognition of this did not necessarily, this social hierarchy did not necessarily indicate that these were meek individuals. So they recognized a social hierarchy, but they still expected something in return. And this is where you get back to this idea of reciprocity. I'll hold you above me, but when it comes down to laws that are going to help me legalize my land title, for example, you need to do something about this, or labor laws, or whatever. There's a sense that you need to give something back. So what I'm trying to do is to put these two things together, because again, convivialismo has been reserved for the elite, even though some have recognized that this sort of way of speaking and engaging with the political culture also exists among popular classes. So I'm trying to put these two things together, and in the process, demonstrate a form of hegemony. And in some ways, kind of recuperate or recover the state, but not necessarily from the state's point of view, but rather from popular sectors. So how do we understand the legitimacy of the Colombian state by the way that popular actors talk about the state or their relationship to it? And the bakers that I talk about, I think, provide a very good example of this. So again, I don't want to talk too much here. Just to give an overall sense of the main situation, in Colombia in the 1950s, the country needed approximately 270,000 tons of wheat to meet all of its needs, but it was only producing 150,000 tons. So there was, almost another 150,000 tons that they needed, that they were getting through imports. Now this wheat was being used for all purposes, for bread, pasta, cookies, crackers, cakes, and of course, bread. However, most people were actually consuming it, in forms other than bread, both then and now. And, bread consumption follows regional patterns in Colombia. So, it sort of correlates to the regions where wheat was primarily produced. So the Central Highlands is it's much more common to see bread consumed there, but also on the Atlantic coast, which had a lot more contact with sort of Atlantic world. So there was a lot of bread consumption on the Atlantic coast as well. So very quickly, do you want me to turn the light off again for a second? Just to talk about the bakers. In 1956, so again, 73 bakers got together and they established Arepan. 4 years later, they had over 1,200 members, so the group grew very quickly. The majority were located in Bogotá, but they were spread throughout the country, particularly, again, in Boyacá, which was also the Central Highlands, and along the Caribbean coast. That's where most of them were located. At the time, it was an umbrella organization, so it included both large-scale, mechanized, industrialist kind of bakers, as well as very small-scale family-run artisan bakeries. All of them, however, faced the problem of flour shortage. And the reason that they got together to form this organization was to lobby the state to renew the PL 480 contract with the United States. The shortages, of course, were regional, some places more than others. The thing is, however, that the idea or the issue of shortage in Colombia is kind of a relative term. And you have to ask yourself, what precisely was lacking? And in fact, there may have been flour available to the bakers, just not the kind they wanted to use. So in Colombia at this time, there were 3 different kinds of flour that was circulating. One was called American. So this was flour that was milled in the United States using grain grown in the United States. American flour sold under brands like Pillsbury, Gold Medal, that kind of thing. There was national flour. And national flour was flour milled in Colombia using grain grown in Colombia. There were also various brands of that available as well. And then there was National American. And National American, which is what they called it, was of course grain that was milled in Colombia, flour milled in Colombia using grain that had been imported from the United States. So it was milled by Colombia's millers. Colombia's millers, the bakers, had completely different interests as far as these kinds of flours were concerned. Colombia's millers, they wanted to make National American. That is what they were interested in, in selling. There were a couple of reasons for that. Part of it was that in the 1950s, many of them had invested in new machinery, and most of the grain produced in Colombia was soft variety, and the soft varieties didn't work very well in the milling equipment that these millers had recently invested in. They preferred the hard varieties that came from the United States. Plus it was cheaper. It was just cheaper to get the grain from the United States than it was to ship it all the way from the interior, the highland interior in Colombia. So that was what the millers were hoping for. The bakers, of course, they wanted nothing to do with National American. So the kind of flour the bakers were the millers wanted to sell, the bakers didn't want at all. They claimed that the millers didn't know what they were doing, they overground the grain, they ended up with this flour that had all these residues in it, it was horrible. And, but they claimed that national flour that was grown and milled in Colombia was too weak to produce bread. But American flour was too strong, so that didn't work either. So what they wanted was a special kind of flour that combined national, produced in Colombia, and American. Now this, of course, was the last thing the millers wanted, because they were being asked to basically take their competitor's product and use it to mix in with a kind of wheat that they didn't even want to mill in the first place. So their interests were completely not aligned here. Now in the early years of the organization, again, it was an umbrella organization, there were lots of gentlemen bakers involved, and they worked hard to present an image of themselves as gentlemen. And they spoke of their relationship with the state as one of gentlemen, as a sort of collaboration. Just to give you a sense of how they did this, they talked a lot in the magazine about how this was an industrialized, so bread making was an industry. They had 100,000 employees. They had lots of articles about labor relations and business management and the technical aspects of bread making, and you can sort of see that represented here in one of the covers of their magazine, exactly. You've got the, in Spanish, the caption, "Times change," so we need to get with the times. In the past, people, milled by hand, and then we had the mules here, but now we've got this sort of industrial form, so, we need to get with the program. They also talked a lot about nutrition and sort of fine dining, good manners. So they had a lot of things focused on cultural aspects, and you could see this in some of their covers as well. So these, very healthy, well-fed, white children, basically white, consuming bread products. And, down here the caption, "Good nutrition gives good appearance." So again, this, however, this was a little complicated because the next cover, in many ways, is always, and one that intrigues me. Good nutrition gives good skin, specifically skin. So I'm still trying to figure out, this one here. But but again, this is an Afro-Colombian child, but, or two children, but they're in nice school uniforms, they've got bows in their hair, this is clearly some kind of, going along with the image that they're trying to present of themselves as being cultured and genteel. And they, contrasted themselves with the millers, who they described as, uncultured men who were not interested in political cooperation. They didn't care about the nation. They were completely greedy. They were using new techniques that were totally inimical to the national interest, and all sorts of things. And this, of course, talking a lot about speculation as well. Of course, when the bakers did this, they were tapping into these larger discourses of convivialismo. To skip ahead, because I know I've talked quite a bit now, this changed in early 1960 when the industrialized bakers broke off, formed their own organization. There was only 20 of them. At this point, the organization had 1,200 members, so it was just a really small proportion. 20 of them was very small. And the new, the bakers that were left, they sort of changed the identity of the organization, talking more about themselves as artisans, as being poor, and they also changed the way they talked about their relationship with the state. So previously, when they were gentlemen bakers, they talked about working cooperatively, because we're all gentlemen here. They made a gentleman's agreement at various points, that sort of thing. The artisan bakers talked about social contracts. There's a contract between the people and the state, and we both have to do our part in this contract. They also emphasize this, just a couple more images. So these were the kinds of covers that appeared before the split. After the split, they were all like this, just different colors. You know, they were a few. Occasionally they had something different, but usually it was just this cover. And then they had wonderful photo essays like this one, talking about how we're all just these, you know, poor bakers. And you can see here, you know, all the bakers are poor, and the few capitalists that exist among the bakers have made their fortunes in other activities. You know, they're doing other things, so they're definitely not us. And you know, the whole thing is talking about, you know, no bakery in Colombia is mechanized. We're all poor, and it's all about, it's a family-run business, and this was also evidenced by the women. And of course, the text indicates that they're helping out, you know, by doing cleaning or decorating cakes. So, you know, the discourse completely changes. Turn the light on and I'll wrap this up. So after the split, you know, relations between the bakers and the state, initially they were kind of, you know, somewhat peaceful, but eventually they broke down. And it was over this question of flour and what kind of flour should be available and circulating. And this is where, you know, there were several issues of this particular journal, this magazine, devoted to examining the relationship between the bakers and the state. And some of the language that they used was really, by the bakers' standards and by Colombian standards in general, rather vicious. But making it clear that that how they understood political relations, the political culture in their country, which was again a relationship of respect and reciprocity, that this had broken down. They, you know, in particular, they accused the agency in charge of you know, overseeing the baking, the distribution of staple goods such as wheat, you know, as a monopolist, a dealer in hunger, a common criminal, you know, so they referred to him in very nasty terms in ways they had never ever done before. And again, just to wrap this up, a year later, this changed once again. There was finally a meeting among the millers, all the baking associations, and the state. A new agreement was hammered out, and suddenly they were all sort of gentlemen and cooperating again. So the tenor changed entirely. So in terms of my conclusions, what I'm doing with all of this, again, processes of state formation in Colombia have been understudied, and you know, the exclusion is an important aspect for, you know, why people assume that the state is weak. But what I'm trying to argue here is that these discourses of convivialismo give us a sort of a way of accessing the state as popular actors understood it, as popular actors wanted to engage with it, and that this can tell us something about the Colombian state that we might not be able to find in the documents of the state itself, which may or may not be available, and that this should be a path that is a path that I'm going to continue exploring as I revise the manuscript. And I will end there. So, thank you.
Stephanie Smith will be giving us a comment and setting the stage for some conversation.
Oh, no. Rebecca, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed your paper and your talk as well. And also, I'm delighted that you used everyday forms of state formation, because when we come up for tenure, we get to choose one book that was most meaningful to us, and that's the book I chose. So if you take the book out of the library, you'll see on the front plate is my name. So it was great. So years ago, my advisor, Barbara Weinstein, remarked that it's difficult to negotiate while staring down a barrel of a rifle. And certainly, there's a grain of truth to this, right? But the relationship between violence and negotiation, as Rebecca discusses, is complex and complicated. It's Through its focus on the bakers in Colombia's National Bread Makers Association, Rebecca Talley's engaging paper, The Politics of Wheat, Hegemony, and Everyday Forms of State Formation in Colombia, examines the issues of hegemony, negotiation, and state formation. Rebecca argues that the historiography of Colombia traditionally has positioned the Colombian state as weak, and therefore, again according to the historiography, scholars cannot apply the concept of hegemony to Colombia. Instead, Rebecca argues that the interactions of the bakers with state officials reveal that the bakers recognize the state's legitimacy. Therefore, an analysis of the bakers and their negotiation with the state apparatus further demonstrates, as Rebecca says, the process of hegemony at work, or the relevancy of the concept of hegemony when analyzing Colombia. Rebecca first begins by providing a much appreciated overview of the historiography of state formation by scholars who studied Latin America. Rebecca moves from 1959 in a discussion of the revolutionary understandings of the state directly to the 1980s and early 1990s, arguing that strongly ideological forms of analysis disappeared, largely due to rethinking of Marxist revolutions. However, here, I would add that the 1968 student massacres in Mexico City also played a major role in scholars' reassessment of the role of the power of the state. Indeed, it's at this point that Latin American scholars such as John Womack and Everyday Forms of State, go back to that, John Womack and Zapata and the Mexican Revolution, positioned the state as a powerful hammer that shut down any negotiation with the popular classes, or what scholars have labeled as the revisionist vision. That was a reaction against the more populist visions of the early social historians that romanticized history from below. The reconsideration of the roles of everyday people, including women, the indigenous peoples, the poor, the grassroots movements, or the post-revisionist vision of the early 1990s becomes even more relevant in comparison to the earlier considerations of a powerful state that negated popular actions. It's within this post-revisionist framework that Gilbert Joseph and Daniel Nugent's Everyday Forms of State Formation, Revolution and the Negotiation of Rule in Modern Mexico first appeared, as Rebecca pointed out, in 1994. Rebecca provides a super clear overview of everyday forms of state formation, an edited volume that played a hugely important role in shaping the ways that scholars considered the role of negotiation within the process of state formation. So I have several questions for Rebecca concerning her really relevant discussion of everyday forms of state formation and the complex issues raised by her paper. One would be, and we can talk about this later, is who were the governors? So you talk about the governors, but as we know, the governors were very different. They had very different ideologies. They were the revolutionaries during the Mexican Revolution. Number two would be that Rebecca's paper raises important questions concerning the definition of hegemony, and I'd like to hear more about her considerations of this concept and if she finds hegemony useful for her study. Let's see, in her discussion of everyday forms of state formation, Rebecca refers to hegemony as a pact or a contract where the popular classes, and I quote, only contested abuses within the terms of the pact. Instead of an agreement, though, where both sides are conscious of their role in a contract, Gramsci wrote about hegemony in the context, as you mentioned, of false consciousness and the building of consent around the values of the ruling class, even if these values worked against the best interest of the subordinated popular classes. For Gramsci, the process of forming hegemony was largely completed through schools, the church, the family, culture, military service, economic issues. And in this way, we can speak of hegemony as an interactive process. But when the hegemonic project fails, elites resort often to violence or military force to maintain their power. Therefore, in this context, I'd also like Rebecca to expand more on the relationship or the connections between violence and hegemony in the context of Colombia and Mexico. Even though the hegemonic process assumes active engagement of the targeted groups, it never negates the coercive actions or aspects of the state. It's always backed up by the threat of violence. So when we consider the Mexican Revolution, where more than 1 million people died from 1910 to 1917, violence certainly operated hand in hand with negotiation. And today, on the heels of Mexico's so-called drug wars since 2006, and the recent deaths of the 43 students, scholars, as Rebecca points out, are reconsidering the issue of violence in Mexico. So how do we understand the relationship between violence and state formation when the state is endangered by violent non-state enemies, like the drug cartels? And how does Mexico's current day situation relate to Colombia's often violent history, or to Colombian paramilitary forces, which, as some scholars have argued, have become informal instruments of state terror? Recently, several new books have appeared that consider issues of violence and negotiation in Latin America, specifically Mexico too. For instance, in Violence, Coercion, and State-Making in 20th Century Mexico, this is from Stanford University Press, 2012, Will Pansters argues that, and I quote, "Research in the hegemonic workings of power have stressed the discursive and cultural dimensions of state-making, as well as negotiations of popular groups with state projects. While the scholarly importance of this work is undisputed, it has downplayed the more coercive and violent mechanisms in state-making, politics, and society." So he also states, though, he goes on to state in his book that his work, and I quote, "subscribes to the critique of Joseph and Nugent and other historians that break away from state-centeredness by privileging society, popular agency, cultural change, negotiation, and the regional context." So in other words, a study of violence in Latin America doesn't necessarily negate the use of negotiation. In 4, everyday forms of state formation critiques Gramsci's notion of hegemony, as Rebecca pointed out. And this integral notion could have important implications, I think, for Rebecca's study. Why do Nugent and Joseph draw their name from James Scott's Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance? Scott argues in Weapons of the Weak that the concept of hegemony ignores the extent to which most subordinate classes are able to penetrate and demystify the prevailing ideology. Theories of hegemony frequently, according to Scott, confound what is inevitable with what is just, an error that subordinate classes rarely ever make. There's a hidden transcript, according to Scott, that reveals people do what they think they have to do to survive economically, but this doesn't necessarily mean they buy into the system. I think Scott's point could be important to Rebecca's argument in that I was wondering if the bakers could negotiate with state officials without actually recognizing the legitimacy of the state. But then again, Alan Knight, who also contributed to Everyday Forms of State Formation, also argues in his chapter, Weapons and Arches, that hegemony, and I quote, seems to fit the historical pattern, or that the concept of hegemony is appropriate in some historical situations. He says that it doesn't apply to every situation, but that it applies to certain regions in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And lastly, I'm not sure that Everyday Forms of State Formation concerned itself with questions of strength of the state, and Rebecca correctly addresses this issue with her discussion of Alan Knight. In what way should we consider the strength of the state as an element that can be qualified, and for what ends? And Rebecca rightly argues that it's imprecise to speak of states as weak or strong, and I agree, especially if we argue that state formation is a process. After her discussion of the historiography of state formation in Latin America, Rebecca then moves to her analysis of hegemony in the Colombian state. It's here that Rebecca draws upon archival research in an area that sorely lacks sufficient study. So I'll be really curious to see and looking forward to reading your book. So Colombia's history during the 20th century is fascinating, and Rebecca explores the complex political developments with skill. For instance, Rebecca discusses La Violencia, the 20-year civil conflict beginning in 1946 that resulted in the deaths of at least 200,000 people, and mostly in rural areas. But of course, it's important to stress that the Mexican Revolution and La Violencia were two entirely different historical events. Here, Rebecca discusses General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, who took over the Colombian rule in 1953 through a military coup. It would last till 1957. As Rebecca argues, after Rojas opened the country to free trade, the popular sectors lauded this move. I was just curious to understand more of the reasons why the popular groups would do this, would support a move towards free trade, especially under a military dictatorship. Rebecca further argues that it was within the violence and economic chaos that the Rojas military rule, Rojas military rule, that the Bakers decided to organize. And I was also curious to hear the reasons why, at this point, that the Bakers, and I quote, granted the Colombian state legitimacy, as Rebecca argues, when the state clearly was experiencing political and economic chaos. So what I was wondering was, why would the Bakers' actions simply not be strategic? They were negotiating with those who held power. In other words, the Bakers could negotiate with state officials or those in power without recognizing the legitimacy of the state overall. So my very last questions are, why did you choose the Bakers, for example? Like, what's the importance of the Bakers themselves? Like, why not some other union? Were women involved? Like, I think you brought this issue really nicely with the photographs of the journal. So, but I was wondering, were the Bakers all men? And then I think you answered that a little bit. Why did they consider themselves gentlemen bakers? Did you find similar actions among women's groups or were there unions with women in them? Ultimately, Rebecca provides us with a paper that raises a number of important questions, and I really look forward to her discussion of the issues. By the way, can I just say your class sounds dynamite?
Reorganize things in his head. Let's see if we can make things a little brighter around here. There we go. Right, sure.
Your email.
Should have done this ahead of time.
I like the contrast of the colors.
Isn't that standard?
Maybe. I changed it. I always like changing my inboxes.
There we go.
Those were pink for a while. Then those were Buckeye red.
Should I address some of the questions that were asked, or do you want to open it for questions, or?
Big one, or do you have a big one you want to address? Maybe not every single one of them, there seems to be a lot.
No, there's some
we should
really-
then open things up pretty quickly,
Yeah, no, there's some real good ones here too. And I hope you'll actually send me your comments, because I tried to write everything down, but it was a little hard. Actually, I really appreciate the question about the Bakers giving legitimacy to the state at the very moment that it seemed like it was the most illegitimate. And, you know, that's actually, you know, it's funny. Colombia has this long tradition of claiming, you know, we're such a great place because we've got these long-standing democratic institutions, you know, constitutional, you know, peaceful transitions to power, democratic, you know, all the formal mechanisms of democracy are in place, and we respect them all the time. And so, you know, this 5-year, you know, this 4-year period of dictatorship is truly an anomaly in Colombian history, and you know, Colombians certainly see it that way, especially now. But I think at the time, Rojas Pinilla was beginning to be seen as illegitimate among some sectors, but not all. And in fact, the elected president who came before him was in many ways seen as far more illegitimate than Rojas Pinilla ever was, despite the fact that he came into power through this very undemocratic means. You know, the president before him, who of course Rojas Pinilla deposed, you know, is the sort of the monster of 20th century Colombian historiography in general, and he was a pretty monstrous man. So there was a lot of, you know, it was actually, very surprising to see. You can see this in the secondary sources and in the primary sources in the archive. I was shocked by, reading different kinds of letters, and suddenly this 1953 moment when he's in power, that, it was as if, phew, we've got this big giant weight off our shoulders, and this is wonderful and fabulous. And among popular sectors, he had a lot of popularity. This issue of why they would support the opening to free trade. I mean, a lot of that was simply because the protectionist policies that the conservative governments, the one before Rojas Pinilla and the one before him, had put in place, were certainly benefiting Colombia's industrialists, but not really anyone else. And prices had really escalated during the years before Rojas came into power. So once he came into power and started, opening things up a little bit more, and tamping down some of the protectionist policies, prices dropped for many consumer goods. So for popular sectors, this was really wonderful. Plus, he also, Rojas Pinilla himself, he eventually went on. He was deposed and then, left the country for a year or two, and then he came back and helped organize a popular party, an alternative to the liberal and conservative party, and which, in many ways, I mean, it's funny. I think for many popular groups, the National Front was seen as more illegitimate than Rojas's dictatorship, precisely because it was this sort of agreement that was privately made among, the party heads in Switzerland. And, popular groups were completely excluded, third parties were excluded. So for many of them, when Rojas Pinilla came back, he helped organize this third party, which became very popular. And in fact, political conflict in the 1970s was centered around that party. There was supposedly an election that he won that was stolen from him. So why the bakers at that moment would give Rojas legitimacy, I think that, in 1956, there were still enough sectors, there were still a lot of sectors of Colombian society that did not, that still saw him as a legitimate president and didn't see the government itself as illegitimate simply because there was this dictatorship. By 1957, things were beginning to change. There was, he began to become a lot more repressive. Economic conditions were becoming worse. And of course, business industrialists got together and organized, helped encourage strikes and a whole variety of things. But in 1956, that wasn't quite that case yet. So anyway, that was a long answer to that. But that was an interesting question, though, just at that moment, why they would give it that legitimacy.
Let's open this up a bit. Yeah. Any questions from the? Yes.
When you showed the kind of the pamphlets of the different when you opened up, and there was a lot of writing. I noticed that the Spanish in it was very simplistic. Someone who's not super well versed in the language can understand it to a relative degree. Was that an intentional move on behalf of the bakers so more people could see it? To maybe appeal to like a U.S. or like a European avenue, or was that or was that just how they published it?
Well, I wish that some of the articles had been so simplistic, though some of them were. I mean, and it wasn't about the language being so fancy. It's just that I was really shocked by some of the grammatical mistakes. I can't understand what are they saying here. This makes sense to me. And some of the things I spent a lot of time struggling with Spanish-speaking friends who couldn't make heads or tails with either. But in terms of the covers and that, the baking magazine was this weird hybrid between sort of organizational newsletter, professional magazine, and popular pamphlet designed to promote bread consumption in Colombia. So a lot of the things they were doing was trying to appeal to all sorts of people to increase bread consumption. So there was that partially explains some of that. Okay. Yeah, exactly.
I had a question question about race. I know you said you didn't really, when you that pamphlet with the Afro-Colombian stuff kind of stumped you. But I was wondering in the gentleman language if you've come up with, if you've read anything in secondary sources or in primary sources of Afro-Colombian identity, with not working with gentleman identity, or what the race culture of that is. And were there bakers in this union that were also of indigenous or Afro-Colombian descent as well, and how did they fit in with the rest of it?
That's a really great question, because this sort of came up a little bit toward the end of our discussion with the graduate students earlier. You know, one of the questions that a student asked was sort of how far or how widespread was this idea of convivialismo? So how far did it penetrate into the countryside? And you know, what I had said in response was that certainly in the highland regions, the coffee growing regions, the areas, I mean, as John pointed out, the farther away you got from Bogota, you know, the less this sort of, you know, mode of interacting in the political culture had resonance. And among Afro-Colombian groups, I'm not sure that it had the same resonance, and of course that would also depend on where Afro-Colombians were located within the country. And this also came up as well, that, you know, there was one region of Colombia that, on the Pacific coast, that's largely Afro-Colombian, where, you know, from the sort of high modernist, you know, from the centrist perspective, you know, these people were really out there. They were like basically savages. This is how they were conceived. I was, you know, some of the images that I saw in state documents, you know, so sort of like a report about national agriculture production would have these representations of, you know, people all around the country, and the Afro-Colombians in that part of the country were always represented in loincloths, always. Yeah, exactly. And you know, so they, you know, from the state's perspective, from the center's perspective, these people were they were just totally out of that discourse entirely. But as I had pointed out in our discussion earlier, in their own letters, in their, you know, interactions with state officials for various reasons, things that came across in the archives, you know, the Afro-Colombians in that part of Colombia used this language, and very, very well. So they, you know, had the oratory down, they had the tone down, they knew how to use the language to interact with the state. Intriguingly, Afro-Colombians on the northern coast, the Atlantic coast, have a different sort of sense of their relationship with the Colombian state and the Colombian nation as well. And I'm not sure that they necessarily, I know less about that part of the country, but I'm not convinced that they deploy this language in the same way, precisely because they're less interested in being part of the Colombian national project. You can see this, you know, repeated in the present day Afro-Colombian civil rights movement. You know, people in the coast of the Pacific coast call themselves Afro-Colombians. We're part of Colombia. We might be of African descent, but we're a part of Colombia. On the northern coast, they tend to refer to themselves as Afrodescendiente. So we're African descendant. This is, of course, no connection to the Colombian nation. And there's a sort of purposeful rejection. So whether or not they know the language of this political, you know, this political culture is one question, but whether choosing to use it is another. So, but that's a good question. And in terms of the bakers, I don't think so. I don't, you know, certainly none of the photographs that I ever saw of them, because they would include photographs of their meetings and things. I never saw anyone that looked Afro-Colombian.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah. So I have a couple of. Yeah, I really found this fascinating and fun to read. I have a couple of clusters of questions, just two. And you know, I'm a cultural anthropologist, as you know, so you could take this with a grain of salt. So, okay, this question that Stephanie Smith had asked about why bakers, to me, it made me wonder your approach to it. Like, was it your interest in the state that led you to this project, or was it the interest in the wheat and the baking that led you? And the reason why I ask is that for me as an anthropologist, I think it's more interesting to start from the wheat and then go from there. Because if you're doing that, it makes me wonder then, okay, what are the competing grains against wheat, right? Like, what's the story with corn? for instance, here, or the story with, I don't know, quinoa, if that's specific to that area.
No, the main thing would be rice and potatoes.
Exactly, rice, right? So these kinds of grains. To me, I felt like this connection with hegemony and bread was not as clear as much as it was about the relationship between bread as bread and politics vis-a-vis this idea of convivialismo. So the other set of questions I had were really organized around the questions you set up in the very beginning. 'Cause to me, reading it felt like you're setting up a straw man and false binary between, around Jim Scott's work, you know, around this top-down model versus bottom-up model, you know, since after all, he's a big fan of E.P. Thompson, you know, I think, you know, like that middle section that you have, it just seems like it would benefit so much from the originality of your own work, from your archival materials. And this, you know, I'm sure it's because I'm a cultural anthropologist that I feel this way. But yeah, the setup of the state in here in the beginning, I'm not really convinced that this language of the weak state that is common in poli-sci and IR is going to be that beneficial here. You know, and it could be that I misunderstood that, and it became clear with the comments that you received that that you're not trying to duplicate this weak state language as much as you're trying to talk about, you know, like political formations through these material objects, through, you know, feeding people. But yeah, like, I don't know, I wonder if instead of looking through more of Jim's seem like a state work, maybe like The Art of Not Being Governed is more helpful here, you know, where at least with Colombia from, I'm just gonna say an arbitrary year, from the 70s on, you know, with, you have competing forces, you know, that, like, one is technically the state, the other is a FARC or whatever, but they're both making claims on the way land should be managed, you know. But yeah, okay, but you know, this is, I hope you start with the bread, and I hope the bread is the leading character in the story, because I think that is a really fascinating picture to show us.
Thank you. That was a lot there. I mean, in terms of what came first, you know, I mean, initially, you know, developing this as a research project, you know, as a grad student, I mean, my initial concern was the state in Colombia, precisely because, you know, so much of what you see in the historical literature, you know, uses the language of the political scientist, you know, to describe the Colombian state as weak. And, you know, so what I was hoping was to try to counter some of that by employing other kinds of disciplinary language, you know, rather than, even though I would obviously need to grapple with, in some way, with this, you know, the political sciencey language, which I did find very unsatisfactory for understanding the state in Colombia. So I was interested initially in the state, and was initially thinking about just sort of agrarian projects, you know, sort of modernization, agricultural modernization projects in general, and, you know, extension agents as agents of the state, and, you know, what kinds of stories about state formation can we find, you know, through an examination of these modernization projects. Unfortunately, I didn't find the material I was hoping to find, and instead I found all this crazy discussion about wheat, you know, and people really going on and on and on about it. And from there, the wheat became really the central object. And then it was more about sort of pulling all these various strands of people who were talking about wheat in the different ways they're talking about it. And then, you know, the dissertation became this massive, like, I have no idea what's going on anymore. I'm trying to make sense of all this. I don't even know what it's about. You know, it's just, they're all talking about wheat and they're all doing different things. You know, so it was really,
But it makes sense if you're concerned about modernization that you take wheat, which is an agricultural industrial project in the States, that gets exported elsewhere. So then, like, yeah, if you can somehow stick in the story of potatoes, right? As potatoes
Well, the potatoes intersect with the steak. Okay, let me ask a quick question. How does, because I'm not clear about this, how does the Miller-Baker dispute map onto, or not map onto, the conservative-liberal Boer split in Colombian society? And then behind that, I wonder about whether there's any differentiation between conservatives and liberals on, in their cultures. Do they both participate in the same way and same degree in convivialismo? But that, you save the second. The first one is Millers and Bakers and conservative and liberal as kind of these archetypal political cultures, really. I mean, institutions. Is there any intersection at all, or are they?
It was a little, difficult to locate that. I mean, the Bakers, I would say, and of course this is, a generalization. I mean, talking about the historiography to generalize it. I mean, this is of course a generalization. When I say the Bakers, it doesn't always necessarily mean the same thing, but certainly the artisan bakers, when they were liberals, they were definitely liberals, and they had long been liberals. There had been some work, the Liberal Party had done some work in the 19th century during the period of liberal hegemony to try to incorporate various artisans, into the Liberal Party, and I don't think that liberal artisans in Colombia ever forgot that, even though many of them eventually became workers, instead of, laborers instead of artisans. But I don't think the artisans forgot that, and for many of them, there were a couple of signs here and there. When López Fumarejo, for example, so the second liberal president came into power, when he passed away in 1961 or 2, I forget, they published these grand eulogies about, López Fumarejo. They didn't do anything else like that for any other political leader at all. That was the only one they had eulogized in any way. They spoke of themselves as, in that period, as Frente Nacionalista, which, at that time it was a liberal president in charge, so, there were lots of clues that they were liberals. As far as the Millers, it's likely that they were conservatives, but I have no way of knowing for sure.
Don't you know who they are, and then know who the conservatives are, and do an overlap?
Yes, but I certainly looked through all sorts of. Yeah, we know there's liberals in all over Colombia. There's certainly parts of Colombia where they tended to be more highly concentrated. Yeah. Certainly Medellin, but there were liberals and conservatives on the coast. So and a lot of the Millers were actually on the coast.
Well, I guess I was just wondering about the list. We know that the top 20, the top most influential Millers, and we know the first couple hundred conservatives, and was there any, these guys members, they're not.
I didn't see anything like that. I did look, there's some, fortunately there's folks out there who do things like compile lists of, who belongs to.
I love those guys.
I know, exactly, yeah, really.
I
would never want to do that, but they certainly exist. But I looked through, these various publications, of giving, and some of them talking specifically about industrialists in the Conservative Party and industrialists in parties in general, but I couldn't find any overlap between the names. So that's
first
where.
Cousins. Extended families.
Yes, so I don't know, but of course, in terms of the kinds of things that the Millers were sort of arguing for, the fact that they were aligned with ANDI, so ANDI was the main industrialist association. And ANDI was pretty much hand in hand with the Conservative Party. So
in the end, it's the Bakers who break with they bare their teeth at a certain point, right? And they lose the convivialismo language for a moment and say, come on, and get pretty vicious because. And that's what I'm suggesting is, don't you want to layer this in a bit? It seems to me, I'm kind of guessing at kind of grasping at something I don't know anything about, but that the whole conservative tradition would have mastered and created the convivialismo tradition. And the liberals, in effect, were participating, but not. I mean, this all gets back. I guess my big question, which takes us till about 5 o'clock, would be, what is the historical origins of the convivialismo tradition? Where does it come from? Is it straight out of the broad consensus among peninsulars in Latin America that essentially dominates? Are liberals in some way, trying to broaden things a bit? But I mean, that's a very simple way of looking at it.
And a really good question, which I think a lot of Colombianist historians would say, yeah, good, really good question, because again, that, this most people, when they talk about convivialismo, they sort of talk about the first 2 decades of the 20th century, they don't talk about it in the 19th century. And, it's usually seen as a response to the Thousand Days War, but clearly, there's something else going on there. I mean, it can't just have suddenly emerged because, there was a war, it was a bad war, it was horrible, yes, but, it seems as though there's got to be something else going on there. But it's unclear, and that's not something, people have described this convivialismo, but no one has ever really looked at its origins. And I don't want to do 19th century history, so I'm not.
That's where it was underway, and I could hand before that.
Well, there's a growing number of 19th century Colombianists, so they can do it. There was another, I saw someone else had a question, but I don't really get to grasp the answer to it.
Anything pop up from your thoughts, Stephanie, that you want to engage with?
No, but actually, I thought your question was very relevant. I think that's something we should follow up.
But I'm struck by this. I mean, I was struck by this idea that I talked to you about a little bit before about reading Eliot's book about comparing North America and Latin America in the colonial Atlantic world. That Latin America was made up, the peninsulars and the Creoles trying to get into that, made up of orders, privileged orders. And it suddenly occurred to me, oh yeah, the privileged order of North America was everybody under the charter, excluding slaves, possibly. Women were protected by the charters, but on property had their possibility of becoming full members of the chartered colony, but the charters in Latin America were very specific, ordered, religious, military, economic, privileged orders, and if you didn't have a claim to be a member of this order, you were part of the popular classes. It's hard to translate the term popular classes north of the Mexican border. It's kind of difficult to actually use that term. It doesn't work. We have to use different terms. So I just wondered about how that plays against this whole story about the assumption whether or not these unions / industrial associations have taken the place of these old privileged orders, and whether that privileged order pattern and the consensus amongst the members between orders back to the 16th century might underlie this convivialismo. Anyway, that's just my rambled thoughts on this matter. I mean, I don't know, Stephanie, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say, but I think your question about liberal and conservatives, I think that's really crucial, especially if you're talking about interactions with the state. Because, I mean, people were strategic too, so they could, but nonetheless, I mean, I think for the bakers who would be, a certain group, that I think it's hugely important. Because, I mean, if they're aligned in one baker's group, then does that mean they're all, I mean, wouldn't there be infighting if some were liberals and some were conservatives? I don't know. I just think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
no, I'm just.
Could they get along at meetings?
Yeah, no, I'm just remembering. Yeah, some other. Yeah, it was much more expressly political. There was during the early years of the National Front. So 1958, when the new president, the civilian president, came in, there was a lot of talk about rehabilitation, and one department in particular, which had really suffered very horrible in recent years. And yeah, the bakers were adopting a lot of, I mean, everyone in Colombia was adopting the language of rehabilitation. Everyone was talking about it in a whole, it didn't matter who you were, everybody, at some point, you're talking about rehabilitation, but the bakers did as well. But it was also, for Tolima, the particular department that some of the bakers were connected to, they were very involved in the rehabilitation projects there, and that was also, it was a very sort of liberal, there was a lot of liberal connections there, but yeah, no, I mean, you know, it was something that came up. Certainly, my advisor asked about this as well, and certainly, you know, she sort of also understood that, you know, because she did her own, you know, some of the things, you know, she did her own looking up things like what are these people's political connections, and she couldn't find anything either. But you know, it's still something that, yeah, I mean, it's there, and they need to figure out how to address it. But I think this broader question, though, just like the political orders, it's, when you asked this earlier, I think it's an interesting question. I think, I mean, I'm hesitant on the one hand to make a claim that this is, you know, sort of long-standing political culture from the 16th century. This is certainly, you know, something that modernization theorists, for example, talked about in the 1960s a lot all throughout Latin America. You know, the fact that, you know, these sort of ideas that Latin America was this place that was unchanged from the 16th century, you know, and that, you know, this is a place that's just filled with feudal, you know, little kingdoms all over the place, and, you know, this is why we need to modernize. And so there was a lot of sort of very unnuanced ways of understanding Latin American history that a lot of North American scholars did, and you know, and it was of course ignored, you know, the capitalist penetration, you know, the very dramatic and serious capitalist penetration. So, you know, I'm hesitant to say, oh, this is a continuation. However, well, there is something, continuation, yeah. Exactly. I mean, I don't think you can ignore the fact that there's some political continuity. I mean, again, this convivialismo didn't just come out of nowhere, you know. So, that's a good question.
Well, it is 3:30, so unless there are further thoughts from the floor, why don't we put our hands together and thank you.